There still are no announcements about the rumored Assassin's Creed Rift game, so today we're going to look at everything we know of so far about it. We're going to discuss the various leaks about Basim as a main character, the Middle Eastern setting, some gameplay references, the potential release window, and way more about the game itself, before moving on to have a comprehensive look about Basim's story before the events shown in Valhalla, in order to have a better idea about when Rift might be set and what historical characters and missions we might see in it. So once again, strap in, these are all the information that we currently know about Assassin's Creed Rift. And let's start with the basics. The first information we got about Assassin's Creed Rift was actually leaked by gaming journalist Jason Schreier back in February within an article that showed how Ubisoft, because of a supposed thin release schedule caused by the pandemic, the misconduct scandals of 2020, and the departure of several talents, decided to turn what was planned to be a DLC for Valhalla into a fully fledged mainline game codenamed Assassin's Creed Rift. In Schreier's words, Rift is not planned to be a huge open-world RPG game like the last three main entries of the franchise, that is Assassin's Creed Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla, but rather a smaller, more concentrated game focused on stealth gameplay, an aspect that according to many wasn't at the core of the experience in the last few years, despite some recent improvements in Valhalla. Schreier also mentioned that the game would star Basim ibn Ishaq, the fan-favorite master assassin / hidden one that was prominently featured in Assassin's Creed Valhalla and who was the reborn version of the Isu Loki, who had held a grudge against the Isu Odin for thousands of years. Finally, Schreier wrote that Rift would have been released before the Assassin's Creed Infinity platform, which is rumored to be an online service platform featuring several games set in multiple settings and that we have discussed multiple times in our videos. This article was the main source that sparked the excitement about the next Assassin's Creed game, but as it is often the case, once the deal is done, once something is leaked for the first time, more connected leaks are bound to come, and in this case, only a few hours after Bloomberg's article, Eurogamer shared another one by journalist Tom Phillips, who confirmed the same kind of info from their sources, but also added that they had heard of at least early plans for the game to include the city of Baghdad, a setting that a few days later was corroborated by journalist and insider Colin Moriarty, who said that the game would have been set in the Middle East, but Eurogamer also added that the game was planned to flesh out the story of Basim before the events of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Now keep it in mind, as it might be important later. The information about Basim being the main character for this DLC turned into a main game also matched an interview, again by Eurogamer, with producer Jose Araiza dating back to December 2021, where the developer stated that quote-unquote, "you definitely will see more of Basim," and at this point, it's not even a matter of if, but rather a matter of when, because there have been a few more official or semi-official confirmation that hinted at the game actually existing. For example, Carlo Rota, the voice actor for Basim, did share in mid-March of 2022 a picture on his Instagram page showing that he was back to work with a mock-up suit ready to record, and in the post he also seemingly hinted at this potentially being related to Basim himself, but that's not all, because Ubisoft's CFO Frédéric Duguay, according to a report by AndyReloads, during Ubisoft's Q3 earning call of this year, apparently gave an answer by saying, "Your question is relative to AC Rift," and stating that he wouldn't comment further, which of course kind of implied the existence of the game itself. Speaking of AndyReloads, a few weeks ago he also published a video whose link you can find in the description, where he did share a number of game files found by his pal Petter that are very much tied to Assassin's Creed Rift. First and foremost, he did share this file name that featured the word Baghdad that seemed to imply that the city was at least part of a prototype for level design, once again confirming that at least in the early development, Baghdad was indeed planned to be part of the game. Then he shared more game files about stealth detection, social blending, and parkour improvements, which looks very promising from an Assassination standpoint, but I also would imagine that these gameplay tests are done for most of the games in some shapes or form. And Petter even found files featuring the name of some game designers potentially working on Rift at the time of when these game files were dropped. So if it is, like we said, a matter of when rather than if, then when is the game going to actually land? While in terms of release window, different sources seem to point to different dates, although more or less within the same time frame. Schreier and Bloomberg reported end of 2022 or beginning of 2023, while Moriarty pointed at the first 2 months of 2023 in his Sacred Symbols podcast, and lastly, another widely known leaker, Tom Henderson, through an article on xfire.com, mentioned that their sources suggested the first half of 2023 as a potential scheduled release. So when would the game be announced then? It's not clear yet. Many of us expected a new Ubisoft Forward conference during the traditional E3 window in mid-June, but it's seemingly not the case, as it was pretty much confirmed by Axios' Steven Totilo, who reported a Ubisoft rep telling him that the publisher won't have an E3-sized showcase until later this year. So unless Rift gets a mention in the Xbox showcase on June the 12th, it's likely we're going to have to wait for a little bit longer to see whether they're going to announce Rift, possibly with a new and official name. Unless they're going to just announce it through social media, but that's highly unlikely. Now we have a somewhat defined idea of what the game is called, at least for now, what the scope for it is, what the gameplay focus might be, and even an idea about when it might get released, so what we're missing is what the story is going to be about, and in that regard, the comment by Eurogamer about this game taking place before the events of Valhalla does help us narrow down the historical setting for the game, which in turn makes it easier to gather all the information we already know about Basim's early story, so that we can finally have an idea about what we might witness when the game is released. So based on what we know, Basim ibn Ishaq was born in the Abbasid Caliphate, the son of an architect. He may also have had some brothers and a son, according to a few lines in the campfire scene in Valhalla, though that scene was intentionally ambiguous as to whether Basim was talking about Loki's family or his own. The Ibn Ishaq part of his name should be, and correct me if I'm wrong here, a patronymic, meaning son of. So again, if I'm not mistaken, Basim ibn Ishaq should mean Basim son of Ishaq, very much like Altair ibn la-Ahad meant Altair son of no one. Thus, Basim was the son of an architect named Ishaq, whose biggest and most famous accomplishment was the construction of the Great Mosque of Samarra, a town located a little more than 100 kilometers north of Baghdad in modern-day Iraq. Historically, the mosque was commissioned in 848 and completed in 851 AD, which gives us an initial potential context for Basim's story in Rift, considering that we find him, I'd say, in his mid-40s at the start of Valhalla in 870. Sadly though, in Basim's words, another man who played the Caliphate game better took the credit for the creation and the construction of the Great Mosque of Samarra, which caused Basim's father to be exiled and die in poverty. Now historically, the man remembered to be the mind behind the Great Mosque of Samarra was the Abbasid Caliph al-Mutawakkil, sorry for the pronunciation there, who around 10 years later in 861 was actually assassinated in a coup led by the Turkic Guard with the support of his son, so we might already have one of the assassination missions that a young Basim might be carrying out throughout the game, if not the final one, considering it would be some kind of revenge for causing his father's fall. In Valhalla, we also got to know that at a very young age, Basim studied the works of Aristotle, Pythagoras, Euclid, and more, and that was because he was quote-unquote consumed with a passion for understanding, which is something that has already happened to other sages, this need for knowledge and understanding that likely originates from the Yisu conscience inside of them. The interesting element here is that in his youth, Basim gave vent to his thirst for knowledge by spending many hours a day in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, which he describes as a great library full of the greatest learnings of mankind, and which historically was a major public academy, library, and intellectual center located in Baghdad that was built in the late 8th century and was one of the most notable buildings of the city of Baghdad and its round core, which was the largest city at the time and was at the center of the so-called Islamic Golden Age, which was a period of cultural, scientific, and artistic growth in the history of Islam, traditionally dated from the 8th to the 4th century AD. So if we were to play in Baghdad and maybe Samarra during the early 9th century AD, we might also get to see this period of cultural flourishing and some of the historical characters tied to it. One such historical character that Basim got to know for sure is the mathematician and astronomer Al-Khwarizmi. In the episode that he tells Eivor, one day he was sitting at the House of Wisdom reading a study by Al-Khwarizmi, and he was startled by the astronomer himself, who even proceeded to teach him about several quote-unquote scientific wonders, including calendars and calculations involving the sun, the moon, and other planets, and more mathematics equations and discoveries. And in front of all that knowledge, Basim asked, "Is this what it is to know God?" That moment was seemingly very important for Basim, who decided to search for wisdom and knowledge ever since, which both matches and clashes with his second personality, that of the Isu Loki. I wonder whether Basim is going to be scared or curious about his early visions of Loki's life as a sage, but I definitely expect such inner battle within Basim in Rift, as that is going to be another hugely important part of his life, that is the slow but sure takeover by Loki's consciousness. Of course, as we know, at some point Basim joined the Hidden Ones, another key event that I personally expect to see in Rift, and eventually trained up to become a master assassin. His mentor during his early years as a Hidden One hasn't been confirmed yet, though we can assume it might have still been Rayhan, the current mentor in the Middle East during the events of Valhalla. So Basim climbed the ranks of the Hidden Ones during his youth. He completed several missions and obtained the full trust of the Hidden Ones Council, to the point that, as we can see in a document found in the Hidden Ones Bureau in Ravensthorpe, he personally asked his mentor to travel to Northern Europe to cleanse it of the Order of the Ancients, and received full support by him. The aspect of his belief in the creed might also be very interesting in Rift. In Valhalla, it does look like he believes not only in the Hidden Ones' cause, but also in the creed itself and its intricacies, even in the modern day when he is released into the world and meets the assassins of the time. His nature of trickster, of course, blurs the lines, making it difficult to understand whether he is using the Hidden Ones for his purposes as Loki, or whether he still believes in the creed even after Loki's consciousness has taken over. And speaking of the shades of grey about his motivations, even the trip to Northern Europe wasn't only oriented towards wiping the local Order of the Ancients branches, because while his intentions might have been true, his objective was also finding the other Asgardian sages. In another letter sent after the main story events of Valhalla, Rayhan also told Hytham that Basim had pushed the creed aside to give priority to a quote-unquote personal mania that has dogged him for many years, which means that his interactions with Loki had started some time before he left the Middle East, and in that letter, Rayhan even recognizes that Basim had decided to travel north because he was chasing his obsessions. This letter, written by the mentor Rayhan after the main story events in Valhalla, also suggested that Hytham would have traveled back to the Middle East to give a full account of Basim's betrayal to his own mentor and to another mentor called Fulad, and they would have met in their newly constructed fortress called Allahamut, which I'd imagine to be Alamut. So I wonder if in Rift, during Basim's youth, we're also going to see some headquarters of the Hidden Ones in the Middle East, maybe Alamut itself, or maybe another building entirely. Anyway, back to Basim's early life. Before leaving for Northern Europe, Basim picked Hytham as the right companion for the travel, and they did travel towards Northern Europe, but they actually stopped in Constantinople, where they were stationed for a time and where Basim actually acted as the leader of the local Hidden Ones Bureau, which we can see in the Song of Glory comics. While staying in Constantinople, Basim also traveled to Antioch with Hytham to fight a new faction of the Order of the Ancients called the Snake Eaters, another bit of story that is told in the Assassin's Creed The Silk Road novel, before he got back to Constantinople and finally caught wind of Sigurd and his mark on the neck, which set in motion the events that brought Basim and Hytham to meet Eivor and the Raven clan in Norway at the start of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So this is more or less the part of Basim's life that we know of up until the start of the events in Valhalla, and that according to Eurogamer could be shown in Rift, though I would imagine that we are going to play Basim's early life in the Middle East, possibly up until he traveled to Constantinople or until he met Sigurd, which would also allow for the writers to have more creative freedom. But of course, that was just the tip of the iceberg for both Basim's and Loki's stories, which we actually explored in our full analysis of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and that started with the analysis of Loki's own secret messages in the Animus Anomalies that we really suggest you check out in order to have a better understanding about Loki's life before the Toba catastrophe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.